When I was a member of the Mormon Church, I believed that this book was literally the most important book on the entire face of the planet. And I grew up hearing that it was the most correct book, that it was the cornerstone of my faith, that no one had ever been able to prove how Joseph Smith wrote this book, that it was a miracle that it even existed. Some called it a marvelous work and a wonder. And I have memories from my Mormon mission and just from my Mormon upbringing of tearfully testifying about how this book was the book that had brought me the closest to Jesus Christ. In a nutshell, what I believed about the origin of this book is that when Joseph Smith was a kid, he went into the woods and he also tearfully, pleaded with God to know what church to join. And this is the sanitized version that I was taught. And that as he was praying, God and Jesus Christ, two separate beings, appeared to him and said that none of the churches were true and that they wanted him to restore Jesus Christ's true church back onto the earth today. A few years later, an angel appeared to Joseph Smith, and this angel's name was Moroni, and he said that there were special golden tablets buried nearby, and that Joseph Smith would be the one to get those gold plates into his possession and translate them into English so that all the world could read what was on those plates. Those tablets that Joseph Smith found are essentially believed to be ancient writings written by the Native Americans thousands of years ago, which Moroni, the character who appeared to Joseph Smith, then buried before his death, and Moroni then reappeared in angelic form to tell Joseph Smith where he had buried the plates before he died, so that Joseph Smith could translate that very important historic record and give it to modern day people as a way for them to have another book of scripture very similar essentially to the Bible. On top of the fact that Joseph Smith claimed that this book came from Native Americans, the initial story of the Book of Mormon is actually that there were some people in Jerusalem who got on a boat and sailed to the Americas. And that's one of the pictures in the Book of Mormon. So if I open up my Book of Mormon, I can see them coming over on this big ship. So the belief is that not just that the Native Americans wrote this, but that the principal ancestors of the Native Americans were this family that came over from Jerusalem, which the Book of Mormon discusses. This claim means that the prevailing belief was that this book is about not just the Native Americans, but that the Native Americans originated from people in Jerusalem who came on a boat to the Americas. The reason this matters is because Joseph Smith actually said the Book of Mormon on the gold plates was written in Reformed Egyptian. And so that's a made-up language, it's not a real thing, but basically because these people came from Jerusalem, they brought their language with them. So the language this book is written in is not in an Aztec or Mayan or other, those categories of native people in the Americas. This book on the gold plates was written in Reformed Egyptian because they originated from over in Jerusalem and they brought their language with them. So this adds another element of kind of disprovability because he's making a major claim here. He's not just claiming this book was written by Native Americans, he's claiming this book is about the origin of the Native Americans stemming from this family that came from Jerusalem. That's a very brief summary of the magnificent story that I once believed about the origin of this book. If you actually have ever read the Book of Mormon, you'll know that similar to the Bible, it can be a little difficult to get through. Mark Twain famously called this book chloroform in print. Just the phrase "it came to pass" appears over 2,000 times in this book. This video, though, is going to be dedicated to why I believe the Book of Mormon is merely Bible fan fiction and is not the nonfiction historic record of ancient Native Americans that Joseph Smith said it was. Please consider this video to be a high-level overview of all of the information I feel is most relevant to this subject. Many books have been written about the Book of Mormon. Books have been written to try to prove the Book of Mormon is what Joseph Smith said it was. Books have been written to try to disprove. And so because there are entire books, many books dedicated to this topic, this video is an overview, and I'm going to put a ton of links in the notes below so that you can go and look and do your own research, do your own reading, and dig into this information as much more as you feel you want to or need to. If you're coming to this video as someone who is a current member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I definitely encourage you to do as much research and reading as possible. You should never make any decisions based off a single YouTube video or a single conference talk. You should always be taking the reins yourself and looking and searching for as much information as you need to feel like you're well informed about the choices you make in your life. For my current members of the church who are coming to this video, if you're looking for a faithful resource, the church has put out something called the Gospel Topics Essays, and this is where they tackle the more difficult questions. They have one about becoming like God, mother in heaven, plural marriage in Utah, race and the priesthood. And so if you're a member looking for a faithful point of view, or if you're a non-member or ex-member looking for what the church is currently saying on this topic, that's one thing I'll put in the link below, which is the Mormon Church's explanation to some of these more disfavorable or critical topics if you're looking for a faithful point of view. In this video, I've broken down 5 major categories of criticism. So we're going to go over 5 different big buckets of reasons why I think this book is a made-up fantasy book and not something that Joseph Smith wrote himself and is a inspired record that is a history of Native Americans. Whenever I call the Book of Mormon Bible fan fiction, many people will comment and say, well, the Bible is a made-up fantasy book too, and I have to say I actually disagree, even as an atheist. I'm not a Christian and I don't believe in God, but the origins of the Book of Mormon and the Bible are very fundamentally different. The Bible, specifically the New Testament, is about Jesus Christ, obviously. There is a full consensus that Jesus Christ was a real person who existed in history as a real physical entity. That is not to say that all those scholars believe he was the Son of God, or that he died for our sins, or that he spiritually represents what many people believe he represents, but they all concur that he was a real, actual physical human being that existed in history. Comparing that to the Book of Mormon, no scholar outside of the Mormon Church has ever said that there is proof or evidence that Moroni, Alma, Enos, or any of the many people mentioned in the Book of Mormon have been real historical figures. While I do not believe in the faith claims in the Bible, there's obviously proof that the place names mentioned in the Bible are real, compared to the Book of Mormon, where none of the place names referenced in the Book of Mormon have ever been linked to actual geographic regions or areas of the globe. While most scholars concur that the Book of Mormon was penned by Joseph Smith, he was the author, not just the translator, in the 1800s, and the Bible is the product of a collection of many authors over a long period of time. To say that these 2 books, the Bible and the Book of Mormon, belong in the same category of absolute fiction is just not true to history, and it's not true to science. Now that I got that out of my system, I'm going to establish just how important the Book of Mormon is to Mormonism as a faith tradition. Joseph Smith taught that this is the most correct book that has ever existed, and that is a line that I parroted all while I was a member of the church as well. And they also believe it's more correct than the Bible because the belief is that through many translations and through the fact that some of the Bible is word of mouth, stories passed down from generation to generation, the belief is that the Bible has mistranslations. And Joseph Smith, after he finished the Book of Mormon, actually took it upon himself to start retranslating the Bible because he was teaching his believers at the time that the Bible has so many mistranslations that it's essentially a corrupted text. And that's why the Book of Mormon is so much more pure, because it's a direct translation from the original source text of the gold plates, while members would believe that the Bible has enough mistranslations and it's so mishmashed together and corrupted over time that it can't be fully trusted as a pure source of scripture. Here's a clip from a speech in General Conference where one of the 12 apostles is speaking to the church membership.
No wicked man could write such a book as this, and no good man would write it unless it were true. any were commanded of God to do so. I testify that one cannot come to full faith in this latter-day work and thereby find the fullest measure of peace and comfort in these our times until he or she embraces the divinity of the Book of Mormon and the Lord Jesus Christ of whom it testifies. If anyone is foolish enough or misled enough to reject 531 pages of a heretofore unknown text, teeming with literary and Semitic complexity, without honestly attempting to account for the origin of those pages somehow, especially without accounting for their powerful witness of Jesus Christ and the profound spiritual impact that witness has had on what is now tens of millions of readers. If that's the case, then such persons, elect or otherwise, have been deceived. And if they leave this church, they must do so by crawling over or under or around the Book of Mormon to make their exit.
So many prepositions. He can't be lying. That talk from Elder Holland was given when I was still a member of the church, and it definitely loomed large when I was a believer. Because instead of contending with any of the things I'm going to talk about today, it feels like he's essentially saying this book and the truths of this book are so ironclad that to even question that this book might not be what it proclaims to be or purports to be, that to claim that, you're basically a lazy idiot who must be illiterate, because it's so obvious on its face that this book is very pure scripture, just exactly what Joseph Smith said it was, that anyone who's questioning that, you're just a dummy, honestly. Even just this kind of logical fallacy to me, that because millions of people believe something to be the case, that is enough to prove that it's objectively fact and true. This type of rhetoric, I think, had a huge impact on me as a member because it is so powerful and it's so sure of itself that if you're already inclined to believe, and if you're already part of this faith tradition, that when someone speaks with such confidence, the impact on you is that you feel that even asking questions is silly. What's the point of asking questions if something is so absolutely true and accurate that someone has this much confidence about it? Even the idea that no wicked man could write such a book as this, and no good man would write such a book as this, which is so funny because if you read the story of Joseph Smith, he does seem like legitimately kind of a bad dude, what with all of the child brides and all. I'll link that whole talk below, but my reason for including this clip is to just really prove just how important and fundamental and foundational the Book of Mormon is to Mormon belief, and that when the Book of Mormon, when you start looking into the origins of the Book of Mormon, or questioning the doctrines it teaches, or thinking about the actual archaeological evidences, or lack thereof, of the Book of Mormon, it's often one of the reasons people end up leaving the church, because when you listen to a sermon or a talk like that, you become so convinced that the Book of Mormon is exactly what they are saying it is, that when you start reading resources that are critical of the Book of Mormon, and you realize that there's a lot of evidence for those criticisms, it's really hard to maintain your faith. As a kid in primary, I learned that the Book of Mormon was the cornerstone of the religion. And I even did little church activities. I'm sure I'll be able to find something that I can put off to the side here, where the cornerstone of an arch is labeled the Book of Mormon. And when you take the cornerstone out, everything else tumbles and falls to the ground. And so when you're taught that, you're expressly taught that if this book falls, the rest of it falls too, and then you realize just how easy it is to knock this book over, it's why a lot of people end up leaving the church over what they learn about the Book of Mormon. You'll also see the Book of Mormon referenced constantly in more modern Mormon pop culture, like there's this TikTok, or I think it's a YouTube Shorts video I found. They're playing basketball. Ooh, so cool. They're really, don't you want to talk to those guys? They're good at basketball. And they're, they're making this little short about about how the Book of Mormon and the Bible are in harmony. And I think it's a major reason why they have titled this Another Testament of Jesus Christ. On my mission, I would say we have the Old Testament, the New Testament, and another testament of Jesus Christ, because Mormons would like to place themselves as in close proximity to general Christianity as possible, while still on the DL claiming they are the true Christians. When you would ask a Mormon, are you Christian? They'd say, yes, we're Christians. But what they don't say is, we're actually more Christian than you because we believe we're Jesus Christ's true restored church as he taught it when he was on earth. And you are living in apostasy, and you will not be a true Christian till you actually join our church. And so I think that's been another careful marketing ploy of the church, which is to not just have the Book of Mormon as inspired scripture, but to place that inspired scripture as closely to the Bible as possible. Sometimes literally in my scriptures, literally as close to as possible to the Bible as here. It is actually bound in the same book. This is the Bible, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price, which is just more books of scripture, which we're not getting in today, but the Pearl of Great Price is actually crazy. When I was on my Mormon mission, people would actually get upset seeing this, which was always kind of funny to me. They would get upset because if you are a very strong believer in the Bible, which a lot of Christians obviously are, you probably don't exactly like what is inferred by having the Book of Mormon and the Bible in the same bound book. Because what this suggests is that they are equivalents. And what a Mormon missionary would tell you is not just that they're equivalent, but that actually the Bible is less important than the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is the true book of Jesus Christ's scripture. You'll also often hear people say that the Book of Mormon is true. In testimonies, you'll hear people say, I know this church is true. I know the Book of Mormon is true. And this is kind of something unique to Mormonism from what I've gathered, that people stand up in the front of the congregation, I used to do this, and bear their testimony, which is essentially speaking out loud your belief in the truthfulness of the church. And something being true has many dimensions to it. So when I say, I know the Book of Mormon is true, what I'm saying is, first of all, I know it's true spiritually. I know that it teaches important spiritual truths. And so that's why I testify, I bear witness that this book is true, because it teaches truths about Jesus Christ. The other dimension, though, of what it means to say, I know this book is true, is to say, I know Joseph Smith translated this book from golden tablets. I know that proves he's a prophet of God. I know this book is true because it is a non-fiction book. It is a history. It's essentially a history book. It's a diary of prophets that were Native Americans who saw Jesus Christ face to face in the same way Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did. And that it's true because it is historic fact. So there's the spiritual dimension of truth, but there's also this is scientifically true that what this book says it is as a nonfiction history book of Native Americans, that is also true. This, back to the cornerstone in the archway, is why when the Book of Mormon falls, the whole church falls with it, and you're taught since you're a kid. The existence of this book is proof Joseph Smith was a prophet. Joseph Smith as a prophet means we're the true Christians, we're the true church of Jesus Christ on the earth today, and the truth of this book in a scientific fact and an archaeological fact and a spiritual fact is proof and evidence, physical evidence. That's what Jeffrey R. Holland is saying in that talk. Evidence that we are what we purport to be, which is the only true church on the planet today. And that's why everyone should join it or they are lost. Now that I've given you a tiny taste of just how important this book is to this religion, let's get into those 5 buckets of why I think it's a made-up fantasy book. The first bucket, which I think personally is the most compelling, is the absolute lack of archaeological proof of the places, people, battles, etc. named in the Book of Mormon. A lot of people like to get in the weeds of the timeline of Joseph Smith writing it between finding the plates, Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery. That that's its own bucket that's coming, and that's often what, in my experience, the argumentation and apologists like to focus on. But to me, the most compelling evidence the Book of Mormon is just made up is the fact that there's never ever been a single piece of archaeological evidence from a sword, a shield, armor, some pottery, a gravesite, literally nothing. No single piece of archaeological evidence that has ever proved that the places and people described in the Book of Mormon were real people who legitimately lived on planet Earth at one point. This is my Book of Mormon from my mission, and as you can see, I read every single page multiple times, and one thing I thought was interesting as I was preparing for this video is just how often let me get closer. As you can see from this map that I have still taped into my Book of Mormon, I received this map, and it's titled Significant Journeys in the Book of Mormon. As you're looking at that map, which I'll also put off to the side here, you can tell that it looks quite scientific. It looks potentially, you know, especially if you are just kind of like a teenager that is encountering this map that you've been handed, it looks realistic enough that you kind of get the sense that this is a real map. This isn't, you know, Lord of the Rings, you know how in Lord of the Rings and a lot of other fantasy books, you open the cover and it'll have a made-up map that looks very realistic, but obviously because you're reading Lord of the Rings or another fantasy book, you know it's a made-up map that is it's fantasy, right? But as you're a kid being told that the Book of Mormon is a real nonfiction book, it's a history book, you get a map like this and you really start to kind of think, okay, this feels real. This feels like it's making a claim that this map is based in something. If you go in my same book, you'll see that, and I'll put a picture off to the side because it's going to be a little hard to see. I did have real maps in my scriptures. So this is a map of the Holy Land. This is a real physical place that exists on planet Earth. Lots of different maps of different places described: Syria, Italy, Asia, Egypt. You know, these are real places described in the Bible that if I hopped on a plane, I could go to this place. It's a real place. Similarly, when I go to the back of the Doctrine and Covenants, because the Doctrine and Covenants is about Joseph Smith and his early church history, where the church was founded. He was in New York, he was in Illinois. So I see, okay, this is a map of Canada, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. If I got on a plane, I could go to these places. So they've provided in this book a book of New York and connected it back to Joseph Smith. They've provided a map of the Holy Land to connect back to Jesus Christ. Absent, though, is a map provided by the church. That map I showed you was a little handout given to me as a missionary. As, you know, as the Mormon Church goes, though, they have not provided a map to show me where the Book of Mormon happened. And that's because it doesn't exist. Mormonism, though, is very pseudoscientific. There's a lot of evidence of the Book of Mormon that is based in kind of made-up science, or science like that map I showed you that feels real, but it doesn't withstand almost any scrutiny at all. The church would say the reason they don't provide a map of where the Book of Mormon happened is because we haven't found it yet, which we'll get into more of that aspect of the Book of Mormon. But that, if, you know, just for anyone who's watching this video, they're going to say, oh, well, you're not being fair because the reason there's no map is not because the church is saying it doesn't exist. The reason there's no map is because we just haven't looked hard enough yet, and we're gonna find the sword of Laban eventually. So that would be their response to that argument. The lack of evidence, though, is not because they haven't tried. And BYU has its own, lots of different, obviously, it's a university. It has departments that really do spend a lot of time looking into proofs of the Book of Mormon. If you go and try to find academic papers about the Book of Mormon, most of them are going to be produced by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints using their science department at Brigham Young University. I recall at one point I actually had a speech, they're called firesides, where they have kind of special speakers who visit different congregations, and I had a fireside, a speech given by one of these people who, one of their research projects, I don't know if it was funded by the church or BYU or if it was just something he had taken upon himself, but one of his research projects was to find archaeological evidence of the Book of Mormon. So he went to South America, because the Book of Mormon, it does describe things like a narrow neck of land. It has enough descriptions that people have really tried to say, okay, what could be the narrow neck of land? Let's go and search across the Americas to find where matches the geography described in the Book of Mormon. And anytime they find a place that maybe is as it's described in the Book of Mormon, they do a lot of digging to try to find evidence of then maybe the battles, the people, anything that is listed in the Book of Mormon, so that they can finally say, look, it's true. It's true. There is real history here. There's archaeological evidence of what's discussed in the Book of Mormon. One thing this man talked about is an ancient Aztec deity called Quetzalcoatl. And Mormons say, I suppose this is all like Mormon pseudoscience, but apparently Quetzalcoatl is a white bearded god who's descending. So this is just what I was taught. So, this is just, like I said, it's kind of made up. But basically what I was taught in this fireside is that Quetzalcoatl is often seen as descending. So Jesus Christ descended to the people over here, the Native Americans. So they depicted Jesus Christ as Quetzalcoatl, essentially. And so when they're going and looking for these real evidences, one of their interpretations is that the manifestation of Quetzalcoatl descending and potentially having a white beard, apparently, that is proof in the archaeological evidence that Jesus did come down from the sky, he descended, and that because Quetzalcoatl came down, that then the Native Americans are inscribing this deity, and this deity is actually meant to represent Jesus Christ himself. And so it's not uncommon that members of the church, especially people who are being paid by BYU as professors to do research into these types of questions, will take something that is already well documented, like Quetzalcoatl. They will take it and say, okay, let's claim this for ourselves and say that this is a way that we can give more legitimacy to the Book of Mormon. And so me, as a Mormon youth, I'm sitting there in my chair and someone is coming to specially present to me the fact that Quetzalcoatl proves the Book of Mormon is true. And when you're a youth, when you're a teenager, it's pretty easy to just say, well, more evidence is great. This is great news. We're fine. Like, I remember when he was giving this presentation, he was so excited and so animated that we've found this evidence and proof. Another thing he talked about is the 3 Nephites. So in the Book of Mormon, it talks about how there's 3 people who are transfigured, so they will never die. And the lore is essentially that they still walk the earth to this day. They walked the earth back then, and they kind of go around doing kind things like helping you change your tire. This is a real story I heard. Change your tire when you have a flat and nobody's there to help you. And so another piece of evidence that he gave in this fireside about science, he showed this slideshow of all these photos of times that he had seen 3 figures on Mayan temples or in any sort of, anything produced by the hands of ancient peoples. If he found groups of 3, he basically showed this as evidence of the 3 Nephites who were talked about in the Book of Mormon. And I want to say there was even a time where he showed us an inscription of Quetzalcoatl, and then down beneath Quetzalcoatl was the 3 Nephites, because the 3 Nephites met Jesus Christ. And he was like, can you believe believe this? And all of us were like, oh my God, this is amazing. And so, you know, now to describe it, it sounds like I'm almost describing a parody to you, but at the time it felt so real and it felt so exciting that the work of Joseph Smith, the work of Jesus Christ, the work of God is continuing to be revealed to this day, and I'm just part of this restoration of Jesus Christ Church, and isn't this such an exciting thing to be a part of? The Wikipedia page, though, not to be a downer, says the majority of Latter-day Saints believe the book to be a record of real-world history. Independent archaeological, historical, and scientific communities have discovered no evidence to support the existence of the civilizations described therein. Womp womp. The National Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. actually got so many requests to look into the Book of Mormon as a piece of real-world history that they did ultimately release a statement about it. The initial statement was released in 1980, but has been edited and added to and changed a bit over the years, but they've never changed the, you know, obvious message, which is the Book of Mormon has no basis in archaeology. They address many different portions of the Book of Mormon line by line, so they have 9 points in this copy of the letter that I'm pulling from, and I will link to below. They also say that no reputable Egyptologist has discovered the relationship between archaeological remains to prove that this was a record of people from thousands of years ago. They say iron, steel, glass, and silk were not used in the New World before 1492. Additionally, they say Native Americans had no wheat, barley, oats, millet, rice, pigs, cattle, chickens, horses, donkeys, or camels, which all appear in the Book of Mormon, prior to 1942. So we'll get more into those anachronisms in a bit, but essentially they just very thoroughly cover a lot of ground very quickly as to all the reasons the Book of Mormon is not a history book. It is a book Joseph Smith penned himself. Maybe some would say plagiarized himself. We'll get into that as well. The next piece of this archaeological or scientific aspect, this bucket, is the aspect of DNA evidence. So the Book of Mormon once claimed that the group of people who came from Jerusalem were the principal ancestors. So that was the word they used, the principal ancestors. So for a while, the church boldly made the claim that people from Jerusalem were the ancestors of Native Americans. And when the science of DNA arrived on the scene, they anxiously ran to go check and see, hey, we can do some DNA testing on Native Americans, and that will prove that Native Americans have DNA from Jerusalem and the Middle East. So that will prove that the Book of Mormon is what Joseph Smith said it was. However, they had to change this bold claim to say that these people from Jerusalem were among the ancestors. This is a much lower word on the rung of certainty. They went from principal ancestors to among the ancestors after it was proven that Native Americans did not come from people of the Middle East. Modern scientists now believe that Native Americans descended from Paleo-Indians who migrated from North Asia to Alaska via a land bridge, not from the Middle East, as claimed by the Book of Mormon. There is a Gospel Topics essay published by the church about this topic of DNA. They essentially say that because DNA science is so convoluted, and they go into a very long and very scientific, ironically, explanation of this, and they just say that their decisive summary at the end is essentially that it's inconclusive and we can't know for sure. But honestly, to go from boldly claiming that the Native Americans are descended from people in Jerusalem, and that's the primary ancestry, to then saying result inconclusive is quite the walking back of that initial claim. The Hill Cumorah, I think, is another really interesting aspect of this archaeological evidence question. So many different prophets claimed that the Hill Cumorah, which is the name of where Joseph Smith found those gold plates, was the place where this massive battle happened. So this battle happened with Moroni. He's the angel who told Joseph Smith where to find the plates, and he was this battle leader. He led a group of 10,000 men into battle, and he was one of only 24 survivors in the Book of Mormon as the story goes, and 230,000 warriors died during this battle. A side note is that you can always tell if someone's not actually Mormon because people always say Moroni, like macaroni, but it's Moroni. So sometimes I'm watching content produced by people who want to talk about the church, but weren't actually raised in the church, and they always say Moroni instead of Moroni, so that's a dead giveaway. And so with a number like 230,000 people dying, that is a massive amount of people. You'd think that when they go and dig up the Hill Cumorah, which is in New York and is right by where Joseph Smith grew up, you'd think when they dug up that area, they would very quickly find many evidences of a massive battle where many people died. They have found zilch at this Hill Cumorah, and it's kind of ironic because early church leaders actually claimed that this hill, they said those were the same two things. So they said it talks about Cumorah in the Book of Mormon, and Joseph Smith lived near the Hill Cumorah, so those are the same hill. And after they didn't find any evidence, because this is made up, they said, oh, actually, blah, 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 we're taking it back, just like we took back the DNA thing. Actually, it's referring to two separate hills who happen to have the same name. And of course, you know, the irony of this is that it's obviously not that hard to find evidences of ancient people. We can still find lots of evidences of the Romans, the Mayans, the Aztecs. We can easily find evidences that people in history existed. They don't just dissipate. We can find ancient evidences of ancient people all over the place. We've even found, fully preserved bodies in the ice. So these things don't just disappear. It's very possible to find evidences of ancient people. We just haven't found evidences of these ancient people. I do think one sad aspect of this is that if you would bring this up to a member of the church, they of course would just say, well, we just haven't found it yet. And that to me is, you could dig 50 feet below the surface of every inch of earth, of ground above water. You could go 50 feet down and just say, we're just gonna lower all land by 50 feet because we are so sure we're gonna find something. And even if you did that, they would still say, well, what about the 51st foot? And that is just what faith is, right? It's not that the belief is not based truly on science, though they would say it is a history book. The belief is based in faith, which is just believing in things that aren't seen. And so when people sometimes will say, well, how does this not just make it so nobody believes anymore? And it's because ultimately the belief isn't based in science. It's based in their hearts and their feelings and their emotions. And those things are not scientific. That is based in the human urge to believe, not in a empirically tested thing that exists in the real world. Basically, their claim would be that the absence of evidence isn't evidence, and people have said that in my comments before. But as Christopher Hitchens says, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. And so ultimately, for the people who don't believe, the burden of proof is not on the people who don't believe. The burden of proof actually lies with the people who are purporting that this is a history book that is nonfiction, that is about Native Americans that really existed. So the burden of proof is on them. And currently, the proof that they have brought forth is not evidence enough that it is a universally accepted fact that the Book of Mormon is about things that really happened in places that are real. Compare that to, like I said at the beginning, the Bible, where many scientists are atheists or do not believe in the divinity of the Bible, but it is universally accepted that Jesus Christ was a historic figure that existed on planet Earth in real physical form. If you're enjoying this video, just a quick reminder to like this video, subscribe to my channel. I release a new video every single week and talk about Mormon culture, Mormon history, Mormon doctrine, my personal experiences growing up in the church, my mission, etc. So if you want to get a new video every week, don't forget to subscribe and hit that little bell button. The second bucket I wanted to talk about is the process of translation, how it was translated, the timeline it was translated in, and just also compare that with what the official or kind of whitewashed, sanitized version of what I was taught as a member. This clip to the side here shows what basically what I was taught, what it looked like for Joseph Smith to translate the gold plates. You'll see that he is looking at the gold plates, reading, like as if you're reading from a book. He's speaking English while someone else is off to the side, translating and writing down the words he's saying as he's saying them, which is, if you're thinking of translating, is essentially what you picture. If somebody has the source text in its original language, the person sitting in the seat can read both the language it was written in and the language to translate into, and is kind of comparing, either writing it himself or speaking it aloud so someone can transcribe the words. So that's what I was taught. This is a little movie produced by the church. I'll link it below. So this is kind of the most sanitized church version. This is also reminiscent of like if I, as a kid, I would have had a storybook like this, similar to this, about Joseph Smith. You can see similarly we have a sheet. Joseph Smith is here holding the gold plates. He's reading aloud from the text while a scribe is transcribing the words. This is a book called Preach My Gospel. This was my manual I used as a Mormon missionary, and you can see this is lesson number 1. So this is the first thing I was ever supposed to teach people on my mission. And here you can see Joseph Smith sitting there. The gold plates are right here as someone else writes down the words he's saying. This is another collection of images from the CES letter, which I'll also link below. The CES letter is a great synopsis of criticisms of a lot of the truth claims of the church. This is the portion where he talks about the translation of the Book of Mormon, and you can see it's not just in this movie, it's not just in a children's book, it's basically whenever the translation of the Book of Mormon is discussed, it's almost exclusively illustrated like I've shown you in the last pictures. Now, here is how South Park showed how this translation process happened. Joseph Smith doesn't have the plates with him. He drops a rock in a hat. He puts his face in the hat and begins to read aloud. This stone that Joseph Smith used was called a peep stone, or also called a seer stone. Here's my little example of my seer stone. So he initially used this stone, which this church still has to this day. It looks like this. He initially used this stone to find buried treasure, but he later used this stone to translate the Book of Mormon. So often the gold plates would not even be in the same room as he would be. He would take his rock and he would drop it in his hat, and then he would put the hat over his face so that none of the light would get through, and his face would be in the complete dark. So it would look like that. After he put his face in the hat, he would then say words aloud, which the scribe would write down. So nowhere near what I was shown in illustrations. Here's a quote from one of the people who helped him translate the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith, he said, would put the seer stone into a hat and put his face in the hat, drawing it closely around his face to exclude the light. And in the darkness, the spiritual light would shine. A piece of something resembling a parchment paper would appear, and on that appeared the writing. One character at a time would appear, and under it was the interpretation in English. Thus, the Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God, and not by any power of man. You can read quotes from Emma as well. Emma was also a scribe. There were a few people who were scribes for Joseph Smith during this process, and all of them say the same thing, which is that the hat was used, the rock dropped in the hat, hat, face in the hat, whatever. For a very long time, the church really didn't own up about this, but more recently, people started raising this as a concern they had, kind of saying, hey, why am I always being shown pictures that look like this if this is actually what was going on? And President Nelson, who's the current prophet of the church, sat down with a historian, I don't know, basically to be interviewed about this. And this is the video of what that looked like. Basically, she asks him, you know, can you show us the process by which Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon? And my favorite moment of this video is that he goes and like slowly is lowering his face towards the hat, and then he pauses, and you can tell that he doesn't want to go full face and hat, and he just wants to gesture, because he knows that if he fully puts his face in the hat, like I just did, that it makes him look so ridiculous that he just can't get himself to go full face and hat. The church published a bunch of images of the seer stone back in 2015, and so this was kind of their full coming out about the face and hat gate. And I think the reason this really bothered people, because when you think about it, the idea that an angel visited someone and led them to gold plates and they translated those gold plates, that's already a pretty fantastical story. So why lie about the face in the hat situation if you're gonna already have this very fantastical seeming story? I think one of the reasons is because stories of angels feels very approachable to the average, you know, Christian person. Stories of a face being put in a hat is much odder and stranger compared to a modern interpretation of religion and specifically Christianity. I think for me as a member, these types of moments really make you feel like if they're lying or misdirecting or concealing this truth or this aspect of this part of my religion, what else are they lying about? It makes you feel like you're not standing on solid ground, when keep in mind, as a Mormon, you spend hours, thousands and thousands of hours devoted to this church. So if you can spend 20 years, for me, 2 decades in a church, and not know how Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon, it really makes you feel like, what else don't I know? What else were they concealing? What else were they lying about? And it really starts you down this rabbit hole of feeling like, if I've been presented this very sanitized version of this, there must be other instances of this. So it really kicks off, I think, a distrust of the narrative you've been spoon-fed, and makes you feel like you have to seek other sources in order to find the truth. You probably noticed when Jeffrey R. Holland was talking, he mentioned, you know, how could he have done this so quickly? That is something he points to specifically as an evidence of its divinity, and that's often tossed about in church, in the Mormon church, where they talk about Joseph Smith translated this in 3 months, is the claim, which is about 8 pages a day, and no one could physically do that unless God helped them to do it. So essentially, the speed by which it was translated is used as a proof of its divinity, and that Joseph Smith could not have physically done that, and so that proves that God was involved. Members will say that the translation of the Book of Mormon happened in 65 days. However, this whole conversation around the 3-month timeline, 8 pages a day, that's just the accepted timeline. And if you look at other touch points of the timeline of the translation, it may not actually be true that he did this project in 3 months. I'll also share the reason I don't like this whole timeline or translation approach to disproving the Book of Mormon is that you're just relying on personal witnesses or personal testimonies or journal entries from people who are just human, people who already had skin in the game for Mormonism to succeed, or who had left and then wanted it to fail. So this is just a grayer area to me than something like archaeological evidence, where you're trying to prove or disprove something about the Book of Mormon, but you're using just human testimony, which is already just shakier ground. So one timeline, which is the church's approved timeline, is that this translation happened in 65 days. However, if you look at another version of the timeline, Joseph Smith received the plates in September of 1827. And then he apparently started to translate some of those characters by January 1828. Then Martin Harris loses some of those pages in June of 1828. stay with me here. Oliver Cowdery then helps with the translation in April of 1829, and then the translation is finished by June 30th, 1829, and typesetting began August 1829. It was then published 8 months after that in March of 1830. So the reason all of that is important is that I just wanted to establish the fact that from when Joseph Smith said he got the plates, which I don't even know he got the plates, but at least from when he's talking about kind of the inception of this project to then publishing the book, that is 891 days between receiving the plates and fully publishing the Book of Mormon. And who knows, as far as going from even the days that the translation was finished and typesetting began, it's 8 months till it's published. I don't think we could definitively prove, because there were no video cameras back then, if even still they're still working on it while the typesetting is taking place, because typesetting is incredibly time consuming. They have to set one letter at a time in order to do this on an old printing press. So I think that is one timeline I've always held in my mind as well, that while the established timeline is that it took him 3 months, from talking about getting the plates to then fully publishing the Book of Mormon was 2 years and 5 months. So that, as the idea of the true timeline of when this project kind of originated to when it was fully concluded, that is a much longer timeline, where we don't really know for sure that what Joseph Smith said is the timeline is the exact timeline. I think there's also some people have also said that because Joseph Smith potentially plagiarized much of the book, both from the Bible but also from contemporary novels that were potentially available to him at the time, that he didn't write 8 pages a day, that he had much longer, and that he was pulling from so many other sources that he's really just cobbling together a plagiarized version of something and isn't writing his own book word for word. If you are in the process of leaving the Mormon Church or struggling with your faith, I definitely suggest checking out my book, How to Leave the Mormon Church. I wrote this over the course of about 2 years. It is an ex-Mormon's guide to rebuilding after religion. And if you were like me at all and you were raised in a hyper strict family that was incredibly devout, even something like buying a tank top or wearing a tank top out and about to go grocery shopping can feel like a massive hurdle after leaving the church. And so consider checking out my book if you're in the process of leaving and you're figuring out how to tell your family, how to get into, trying coffee for the first time. Everything that I learned about leaving the church, I put into this book. Our third bucket of evidence the Book of Mormon is not what I was taught it was, is the evidences in the text itself. For this portion, I'm going to bring back my Bible onto the stage, and 30% of the book of Isaiah is found in the Book of Mormon. Mosiah 14 in the Book of Mormon is a reproduction of Isaiah 53. 3 Nephi 13 copies Matthew chapter 6 almost word for word. And so essentially, Joseph Smith borrowed a lot from the Bible and put it in the Book of Mormon. Sorry, I'm holding it the wrong way. The funny thing is that Joseph Smith is treating this like this scripture. So say Matthew 6. Matthew 6 is not in the Book of Mormon because the Native Americans had access to the Bible. Matthew 6 is in the Book of Mormon because prophets received the same revelation that you can find in Matthew 6, and that ended up word for word in the Book of Mormon. So it's not that the Native Americans had access to these religious texts. It's essentially that they're receiving the same revelations from heaven and writing them down in the same exact way the people in the Holy Land received those revelations. The ironic part about this, though, is that the errors that Joseph Smith had in his version of the King James Bible ended up in the Book of Mormon. So what that means to me is that Joseph Smith is not staring at the gold plates and reading them aloud and is just translating aloud as he's reading, blah, 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 blah. This is what the book says. Joseph Smith is standing up from his chair, moseying on over to the King James version of the Bible he has in his house, and he is copying word from word the words in the Bible and then putting them into the Book of Mormon, which shows he's just plagiarizing from the Bible at that point. He's not translating inspired words from prophets of old. Another irony that I thought was interesting is that, as I said, Joseph Smith, after he finished the Book of Mormon, took it upon himself to retranslate the Bible, but the ways that he retranslated the Bible, those perfections, those updates that he put in his Bible aren't in the Book of Mormon. So he fixed the Bible, but when he put his original Bible in the Book of Mormon, he didn't fix it as he was doing it. So the errors that were in his King James version of the Bible ended up in the Book of Mormon, and then even those words, some of them he ended up changing. The same thing happens with italicized words in the King James version. The words that Joseph Smith had italicized in his version of the Bible end up italicized in his manuscript of the Book of Mormon. And so down to the way the words are italicized, he's clearly just copying from the Bible. He's not translating the words given by Mosiah from the Native American prophet. He's actually just stealing from the Bible. In the CES letter, he also has a good list broken down of place names and words that existed in the time of Joseph Smith that also come up in the Book of Mormon. I'll put that list here, and that is just more evidence that Joseph Smith is kind of borrowing and taking from the things around him and is not translating an ancient book. This chart also shows that there are a lot of similarities between a book published in Joseph Smith's time called The View of the Hebrews that has a ton of similarities to the Book of Mormon. And so this chart, which I'll also include a link to below, this list is basically proof of the theory that Joseph Smith plagiarized a lot of the Book of Mormon from a book like The View of the Hebrews. Similar claims are made about a book called The Late War. The View of the Hebrews was actually written by a man named Reverend Ethan Smith, and Oliver Cowdery was in his congregation when that book was published. And so there's a good chance, it seems like it's feasible, that Oliver Cowdery essentially got a hold of this book, View of the Hebrews, and then brought it to Joseph Smith to aid in translation. In addition to these two books, The View of the Hebrews and The Late War, there was another book called The Mound Builder Myth. This book portrayed Native Americans as descendants of the ancient Israelites. So this was a book that existed prior to the Book of Mormon, and this was a popular theory back then that Native Americans were from the Israelites. So this idea that Joseph Smith had that is in the Book of Mormon, which is that someone came on a boat from Jerusalem and landed in the Americas and was the reason there were Native Americans here. This wasn't just ultra super random. This is a very common myth or lore or story that was told that was even present in texts that suggested that this was the origin of the Native Americans. And so once again, I think Joseph Smith was just a master plagiarizer because he pretty consistently, from Masonry and the temple ceremonies to Isaiah in the Bible to the stories of the Native Americans, I think he was just a master at taking from all these different ideas and cultures, whether it was Egyptian or whatever, and making it his own in a way that he was charismatic enough to pass off as its own unique thing. In addition to all of the errors in his Bible ending up in the Book of Mormon, there were also over 100,000 changes made to the Book of Mormon since the initial manuscript. Now, Joseph Smith did not put punctuation, like no punctuation was in the initial manuscript he wrote of the Book of Mormon. So a lot of those changes are just grammatical changes where they're adding commas, quotation marks, periods, etc. However, there were also a lot of changes made over time to clarify doctrine. And so when you look and read apologists, people who are trying to prove the Book of Mormon or answer critics of the Book of Mormon, they will always lead with, hey, these are mostly grammatical changes, punctuation updates. So this whole, Book of Mormon has been changed so many times, you can just brush that under the rug, it's not that big of a deal. But they always lead with that, and then at the end will say, there were a few changes made to clarify doctrine. They didn't change doctrine, it's just clarifying, and I'll put those changes off to the side here, some of them. And so when you're researching this stuff as a member, you feel very gaslit because you you see there were changes, but they're telling you, oh, well, don't overreact. I mean, they're just grammatical changes. This isn't really that big of a deal. Because when you hear the number 100,000 changes and you've been taught this is the most correct book that's ever existed, it doesn't exactly align logically. And so there are grammatical changes, but there also have been changes or clarifications made to the doctrine that is in the Book of Mormon. Another piece of evidence that Joseph Smith is the one who penned the Book of Mormon is the evidence of anachronisms. So an anachronism is something that exists in a text that reveals it wasn't written in the time that the author is trying to claim the text is written in. An example of this is that when Shakespeare wrote Julius Caesar, there is a clock in the play, and clocks would not have existed in the time period of Julius Caesar. Similarly, if I'm writing a, crime novel that's set in the 60s and someone pulls out an iPhone, it would immediately feel to you off because you would know that in the 60s they didn't have iPhones. So these elements that authors sometimes put in texts can feel quite natural, because if someone's in a war, they should be riding a horse, because if I'm thinking of wars and I'm Joseph Smith, seems like if I'm a Native American, I should be depicted on a horse. But when we investigate the text more thoroughly, we see that a lot of the things that Joseph Smith chose to put in the text wouldn't have existed, or there's no archaeological evidence to show they existed in the time period Joseph Smith is saying the book originated in. Like I said, Wikipedia has a great list of this. We have horses, cattle, oxen, sheep, swine, goats, elephants, yes, elephants, wheels, chariots, wheat, silk, and steel, and iron. I remember talking to a church leader about, hey, it says there are elephants in the Book of Mormon. I've never seen Native Americans depicted on elephants. I've never heard Native Americans had elephants. Did they die out? And I remember them saying, oh, I don't even remember what they said. But whenever you raise concerns like this, it's always they just kind of dismiss your concern with as little fanfare as possible. And I'm sure they just said something like, oh, they probably existed back then and then they all died out. And I just, as a kid, was like, makes sense to me. There are tons of research papers written about these things. And sometimes, for example, with steel, there's been no evidence of pre-Columbian iron smelting in the Western Hemisphere. But then sometimes they will change the goalposts. So they'll say, well, it wasn't actually steel, it was an obsidian blade, and Joseph Smith wrote it down as steel. So sometimes what they do, instead of just saying, well, we don't know why that's there, or you're right, this is proof the Book of Mormon isn't real. Instead, what they'll say is essentially, well, Joseph Smith used the word horse, but he actually meant a tapir, or Joseph Smith used steel, but he actually meant obsidian. And they'll kind of rewrite it in a way where they're saying, oh, well, this word was translated to be this, but if you look back far enough in the history, or if you read around or read between the lines, it actually is referring to this. And maybe I could swallow that if it was one word, but there's as I said, there's this entire Wikipedia page with lists and lists and lists and lists saying here are all the anachronisms in the Book of Mormon. And so a lot of these evidences, it's why as a member, when you're having a faith crisis and you're reading all of these apologist voices, it can actually damage your faith more, purely because the explanations are so weak and thin and illogical that you're like, this is the best we got. This is the best explanation for why this exists, because this explanation is trash. And if this is the best we got, then we really are in hot water. One common claim that I've heard as proof of the Book of Mormon being what it purports to be is called, it's a claim about the stylometry of the Book of Mormon. And this is apparently a type of science which is a way to statistically analyze the words of a book to determine certain things about it. So, for example, with the Book of Mormon, some studies have used stylometry to prove that the Book of Mormon has multiple authors, because just like the Bible, the Book of Mormon has many different books. So there's the Book of Mosiah, the Book of Nephi, there's the Book of Enos, there's the Book of Alma. So they are trying to prove, hey, just like the Bible has lots of different authors, the Book of Mormon has lots of different authors, and the way that we can prove that is through something called stylometry. Here's a quick clip from a YouTube channel which tries to prove the authenticity of the Book of Mormon.
Since its publication in 1830, many have wondered who wrote the Book of Mormon. Believers claim it was written by ancient prophets. Skeptics often assume Joseph Smith or an associate wrote it. In order to shed light on this issue, several studies have relied upon a type of statistical analysis called stylometry. Stylometry.
I love that they show a smart-looking man during that part, because science will help us know the Book of Mormon is true, unless it's all those damn archaeologists. We need the Mormon scientists on this.
Stylometry measures linguistic patterns and can identify an author's unique writing habits. It has most famously been used to help answer questions about texts with disputed authorship, such as the Federalist Papers and some of Shakespeare's plays. Over the past few decades, various stylometric studies have been conducted on the Book of Mormon. A 1980 study was the first. By measuring patterns of function words, it concluded that the Book of Mormon has multiple distinct authorship styles, and that none of these styles match the writing habits of Joseph Smith or his associates.
It can be responsibly concluded that the Book of Mormon is exactly what we wanted it to be. So I did look into the stylometric studies that it discusses in this, and I'm not saying stylometry is pseudoscience, because obviously it is a science that is legitimately used. So this video also connects to this article, which is an analysis or a kind of a deeper breakdown of some of these different studies. And in it, at the end, it says, basically, while two of the studies each reached conclusions inconsistent with the Book of Mormon's claims of authorship, both were later found to be fundamentally flawed. In contrast, the Larson, Hilton, and Field studies each produced sound results. So if you had to take a guess, what would be the faith origins of the people who had the studies that were inaccurate versus the faith origins of the studies that were found to be structurally sound? So if you look at Holmes, he was not a Mormon, not a sound study. Jockers, ex-Mormon, not a sound study. Larson, Mormon, sound study. Hilton, Mormon, sound study. Fields, Mormon, sound study. So as they're breaking it down, they're essentially making the claim that the people who have the bad studies we're not going to listen to, if you research those people, they're either ex-Mormon or not Mormon. And if you research the people whose studies were great work and just magnificently done, those people were Mormon. To me, it's the issue I have with BYU doing all of this research into the Book of Mormon, because if you go into a scientific endeavor with the specific desire to find an outcome that aligns with your bias, you're not doing science. That is not what science is. Science fundamentally is not meant to be approached from the perspective of trying to prove a pre-held idea or conclusion. Scientific theory is meant to be approached with the idea that you should be able to really look into a question or a hypothesis without having a bias of trying to confirm something that you already believe. Which, to me, the idea that BYU is even doing these research studies is anti-science, because they're approaching this question trying to prove something. They're not approaching this question with the even the ability. These professors don't even, if they find evidence that proves the Book of Mormon is false, they would just lose their jobs. So that's not science, that's not research, that's confirmation bias. Which is why, at the beginning of this video, I said, I'm an ex-Mormon. I don't believe in the Book of Mormon. This is my bias. Because at least if you're willing to say and come forward and say, hey, I have a bias, this is what my bias is, then I feel like at least the audience can know where you're coming from and you've been fully transparent about your position. Whereas if you're publishing a study and trying to make it seem quite scientific without really honestly revealing your bias, then that to me feels fundamentally dishonest. If you're trying to say, we're doing science, but also we're trying to prove our confirmation bias, we're trying to prove our faith, then you can't say you're doing science and do, like, those two things cannot exist in the same universe. So this whole question of stylometry, I think, is an example of this Mormon attempt to use science, but only when science is on their side. And that is very illogical, that's anti-intellectual, and it's something that I find to be quite dishonest in their approach to proving if something is true or not. My fourth bucket is just the amount to which the church has tried to hide the truth about the Book of Mormon over the years. Like I said about the translation of the Book of Mormon using the hat, when you find out someone is lying to you, you really have to wonder why. One example of this is how they've minimized the role of the seer stone until about 2015, which is not that long ago considering how long the church has been around. For much of the church's history, the church primarily taught that the Book of Mormon was translated using something called the Urim and Thummim, which is something in the Bible. So the Urim and Thummim shows up in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And using this term, Urim and Thummim, as a translation device, in the same way they bind the Book of Mormon and the Bible together, literally bound together in this book I carried on my mission, they also use the Urim and Thummim to bind the translation with modern day Christianity and with the Bible. So they're able to say, just like we see this instrument being used in the Bible by prophets and spiritual people, this instrument was also used by Joseph Smith. This instrument was also used by Moroni. And so this ties a pretty bow on it to say all of these things are internally consistent with Christianity and so don't need to be questioned. However, the use of a seer stone speaks much more to Joseph Smith's treasure digging and mysticism than the church was willing to own up to. And so when you find out about the seer stone after mostly only hearing about the Urim and Thummim, that to me is proof that the church kind of knows that it isn't what it says it is. The Book of Mormon isn't what it says it is. Another thing the church has really downplayed, especially early on in its history, is how many changes were made to the Book of Mormon. Historically, the church has really highlighted the divine and unchanging nature of the text. Joseph Smith called it the most correct book on earth. Bruce R. McConkie said it contains the fullness of the everlasting gospel. When they do talk about the changes, they very much highlight the changes to the grammar and the punctuation and downplay the changes to the doctrine. For example, it used to say that the Lamanites, a tribe in the Book of Mormon, were cursed with black skin for being wicked, and it described them as white and delightsome, and the church changed it from white and delightsome to pure and delightsome. So changing it from white to pure is not a grammatical change, it is a change in substantive meaning. Another huge aspect of the Book of Mormon is the testimony of the 3 and 8 witnesses, which is present in the front cover of the book. And the way the church has talked about these testimonies, they've always said that these witnesses were proof of the authenticity of the Book of Mormon, but some of the witnesses, like Martin Harris and David Whitmer, later said that they saw the plates not with their physical eyes, but their spiritual eyes, which obviously is meant to say, or it seems to say, that they didn't actually see the gold plates, but they had them revealed to them in almost like a dream-like state, that they believed they saw them, and so they did. Oftentimes, the testimonies of the witnesses were much more nuanced, or what they said to friends, parents, what they said to contemporaries, those things were much more nuanced than what ended up as their testimonies that they signed their name to in the Book of Mormon. The church often also loves to claim these witnesses in the Book of Mormon, but later when a lot of these witnesses ended up leaving the church and speaking out against polygamy and becoming excommunicated, the church stops using them in their history to prove the authenticity or the truthfulness of the church. And so we see these people's names used only when it's convenient for the church to use their names, and as soon as these people start speaking out against the church, they disappear from the narrative of church history entirely. Another thing that I found interesting in my research is that for a very long time, much of the resources about the church were concealed from the general church membership and even from a lot of historians. So because the church has been so long-standing, typically when they have certain documents like the Journal of Joseph Smith or original manuscripts of the Book of Mormon, they keep those and they keep them within the church. And they haven't made these manuscripts of a lot of these sources widely available to whoever wants to view them. So if you're a member, you're probably familiar with the Joseph Smith papers, which is kind of the entirety of Joseph Smith's work published into there's tons and tons of these books. The print edition of the Joseph Smith papers consists of 27 volumes, divided into 5 series: documents, journals, revelations and translations, histories, and administrative records. This project to publish these books began in 2001 and ended in 2023. So prior to the publishing of these documents, from what I understand, it was actually pretty hard to get a hold of some of these papers, some of these documents, because they were in the church's possession and they weren't open access and they weren't online, and it was pretty secretive. And a lot of these documents are about polygamy. They're about some of the excommunications, some of the disfavorable things that the church in the past has kept very quiet. The final bucket I wanted to discuss is just the content of the book itself as proof that it is not a divine book. Our 5th bucket is the messed up content of the book. And the reason I left this for 5th is this is actually something I've probably talked about the most on my channel. I've talked quite a bit about how in 2 Nephi 5:21, it talks about how the Native Americans who are evil are cursed with black skin, and how that is obviously aligning with the 19th century Eurocentric racism that existed in Joseph Smith's time, and not the God that would love all people and would not discriminate based off the color of skin that we would think would exist if God is what he says he is, if Christ is what he says he is in the New Testament. And so the content of the book, specifically the morality of the teachings of the book, is also proof that it is not a holy or good book from God. To me, if God changes with time, if God changes with society, even though we're led to believe God is unchanging, if his doctrines change and his positions change, and the worthiness of women to be in leadership positions, or the worthiness of black men to receive the priesthood, if these things can change with history and also simultaneously obviously be changing with society and culture and the times, then that just is proof to me that God is a construct. It's a human construct. It's not a divine being that is all-powerful and ever-present and unchanging. On top of the racism present in the book, we also see sexism. There are about 200 male characters listed in this book and only 6 women present in the book. Of these 6 women, they are all portrayed as wives and mothers and secondary side characters. We don't get a woman who's writing one of the books in the Book of Mormon. We don't get a woman prophetess. We only get 6 women to begin with, and they're all very much background characters. There's also just a lot of violence in the Book of Mormon. If you've spent any time reading it, you know there's tons of wars, and the wars, there's a portion where people get their arms cut off. It's just a very violent book. In First Nephi, just within the first few pages of the book, chapter 4, Nephi cuts off his enemy's head. And not just that he cuts off his enemy's head, but that God tells him that's what he should do. In verse 10 we read, "And it came to pass that I was constrained by the Spirit that I should kill Laban. But I said in my heart, never at any time have I shed the blood of man." And the response is basically from the Spirit is that it is better that one man should perish than that a nation should dwindle and perish in unbelief. And if you're familiar with Under the Banner of Heaven, this same storyline is what they used as a reason that it was okay to kill, because the Book of Mormon teaches that And even in Brigham Young's time, they were also killing people over issues with Mormonism over in Utah and the frontier. So murder and violence in Mormonism is, I think, more common because the religious text teaches that it is actually okay to cut off someone's head for religious reasons. Laban, to be clear, has not attacked Nephi. He's actually, in this, he's incapacitated because he's drunk. And so this idea that Nephi has a justifiable murder of Laban just based off of his religion is really messed up, because Laban is not able to defend himself, and God is egging Nephi on to kill him on the basis that he needs to protect his religion. And it came to pass that the Spirit said unto me again, slay him, for the Lord hath delivered him into thy hands. So this is some real violence. In verse 18, it said, therefore I obey the voice of the Spirit, and took Laban by the hair of his head, and I smote off his head with his own sword. So, I mean, that's pretty violent. And I remember even reading that as a kid and just feeling like, dang, like I'm not even allowed to watch rated R movies, and I'm reading a pretty violent book and being taught that it's the most important book ever written. And so that is the conclusion of my 5 buckets. I'm sure I'll get a lot of comments of people saying, why didn't you cover XYZ? It's purely because there is such a vast amount of information and writing and research and studies that have been done on this topic that it is actually impossible to include it all in a single YouTube video. I will put a ton of links below. Like I said, also at the top, sometimes if you come across the type of content when you're a member of the church, it can feel kind of scary to confront something that threatens your worldview. And so I definitely suggest reading primary sources, going and looking through those links I posted, read the faith promoting versions that the church has in their gospel topics essays. Seek as much information you need to seek so that you can make an informed decision about your life. Because I think that also is an element that is missing from the church's narrative, which is often that you should not seek outside sources. They'll say that expressly, that you shouldn't be looking or listening to sources like this. And so I would say the opposite, which is that you should never make a decision based off of one point of view. You should seek as many points of view and as much learning and education and resources, and do as much research as you need to do so that you can make an informed decision about your life. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I have a new video every week. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment if there's something that you feel like still needs to be said, or a resource that I should have included. I'm happy to update my list of resources if there's anything I left out that feels especially important or pertinent. Also, a quick reminder that this video was available early and ad-free on my Patreon. If you want to consider joining my Patreon, I would very much appreciate it. And as always, I will see you all next week.